Hey everybody, welcome back to theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Again, that website address, if you don't already know what it is, it's www.theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Today I'm joined by one of our regular guests, Mr. Darshan Kulkarni. Darshan, if you've been following this blog for any time at all, you no doubt have seen probably one of Darshan and I's classic interviews. Each one is classic. And it's because of this man here, Darshan. He is an attorney. He's also a pharmacist. He's an educator, author, right? Don't you have a book out? A couple of books,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He just does a lot of things. He's a speaker. He also has a blog of his own, which we will talk about. And there's a lot of things that this man is working on. But because of his unique background, being an attorney and a pharmacist, he can kind of use both of those skill sets and expertise to navigate you through your challenges that you're facing in clinical research industry. He has a unique understanding of both aspects, the regulatory and the science behind most of your issues. So if you ever need an attorney, you have Darshan. And for this video, I just want to let you guys know that yes, Darshan is an attorney and a pharmacist, okay? But please don't use this as legal advice. You have to pay your own attorney. There's just no other way around this. We all love free stuff. We hope that you're entertained from this information here, but don't use it as legal advice or medical advice. God forbid someone would use it as medical advice.
May not apply to you. That's the only thing we're worried about.
Yes.
The exceptions that you haven't considered.
Yes.
Considered.
Right. So please just, use common sense and call Darshan if you need an attorney. Right?
Yeah.
Hit him up on Twitter. He's all over the place. It's not like he's trying to hide. All right?
Thank you, Dan.
So, with that being said, let's get into a viewer question, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's regarding investigational products for emergency use. Okay, so this person was asking, can an investigational product ever be used outside of a study protocol? Or, what are the different scenarios that an investigational product can be used in the not so traditional sense of a clinical trial setting?
Okay. Two big things, as you know, and Dan's an expert as well. But there are two ways the word experimental use comes up, and outside the traditional emergency use context comes up. The big thing to think about is there are certain situations where a product may need to be used in a way that was not where you can't get typical informed consent. So let's say you've got someone who is bleeding profusely and you have a type of blood product that you want to test. In those situations, there are certain exceptions that can be made. There's an FDA guidance out there. And the FDA guidance discusses basically how a study should be run if you have if your protocol doesn't allow for a patient to get full informed consent. In those situations, you basically go to the community, you ask them for permission to do the study, then you put out advertisements, etc., asking them that you're going to be doing a study in that area. And if you're going to be doing a study in that area, you want to have community input, and they sign up for those studies in that context, and they can waive themselves out, etc., in that context. So that's one type of experimental use. The other type of experimental use is if you want to, as Dan said, in the case of the study itself, where you want to use the study for a specific individual, you want to use the drug for that specific individual, but you're doing it outside the scope of that protocol. For some reason, you don't meet the inclusion or exclusion criteria, or for some reason the patient doesn't qualify. In those situations, you can still use the product, but you need to run it by the sponsor. The sponsor has to be the final word on it because, quite honestly, the study supplies are allocated in a specific way, and you don't want to be the physician who sort of screws up the allocation. If the sponsor agrees, that is at the sponsor's discretion, but you also have to recognize the sponsor may not be able to use that data for efficacy. However, the sponsor may still have to use the data for safety. So it's a lose-lose proposition for the sponsor in that context, because he or she cannot use it to say the drug works, but they can say that the drug has these problems associated with it.
So what incentive would the drug company have to allow this? Under
Well,
what circumstances?
Well, one of the great things about it is, A, you're saving lives. So I've met CEOs who said, that's what I'm in business for. I'm here to save lives. If my drug can, or my potential drug can do that, I'm happy to allow that to happen. So I know pharmaceutical company CEOs who've said, yes, it's outside the protocol, but it's something that we want to encourage. We're trying to save lives. From the site level, though, an important thing to consider is, now with the new Physician Payment Sunshine Act that's come out, a drug that's been given to you to use may land up being, and again, you have to see how this is going to work out specifically in your case, because there are a few different ways this can go, but it may land up being a payment made to a physician. So as a payment made to a physician, suddenly you may have a situation where you're being told that this 3 grams of drug that were given to you are now worth $50,000.
Wow.
Yeah. So is it
Even though it's clearly not for the physician, I mean, it's for the patient, right?
May or may not be. That's why you need to be clear as a physician how you set that up.
So if the physician charges his patient for it, then that can be seen as money or revenue to him.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes some sponsors, if you're doing medical device studies, as you know, sponsors will charge patients for these drugs as well, or for these medical devices. So again, is a patient willing to incur the cost of that?
Right. And I could see how it could be considered like a gift to a doctor if you can boast that you're the only clinic in the area to have this investigational product. No one else is using it. It can get to that point where it's like promotional, right?
Absolutely. So you have to be careful about how you're doing it, what you're putting out there, and how the sponsor sees it. And you want to have that negotiation up front. The last thing you want is at the end of the year, the sponsor says that, oh, we saw this as a payment to you. And you're saying, no, 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 this was for the patient, and I dispute this.
Mm-hmm.
There is a provision in the Sunshine Act to dispute, but you'd really rather resolve it on the front side versus on the back end.
Now, what about in oncology? Like, this always comes up in cancer patients.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you're doing a cancer. I'm an investigator. I have a cancer study going on, and a lot of my patients can't qualify. You know, they're too sick. But I have a feeling this drug maybe can work for them, and that's, you know, we don't have any other options. What can I do? I can't put them in the study because that's protocol deviation. But is there a way I can still give them the drug?
And that's exactly where you reach out to the sponsor. You ask them whether I can. Now, the big question to ask is this a unapproved drug, or is this a modification of an existing drug? So let's say you're taking a product that already exists and you're modifying the methodology. Well, depending on how you're giving it, whether it's what's called a 505B1 or a 505B2 type of product. So a B2 product is typically one that's a modification of an existing one. In those types of situations, a pharmaceutical company may be hesitant to say yes. If it's a B1, there's nothing like it on the market, yeah, you may have a decent argument to make to the pharmaceutical company, especially if you're talking about a late phase product. So you're going to have a tough time convincing someone that a phase 1 product should be given to a subject that doesn't qualify, because no one really knows what it does.
Right.
But if you have an adaptive study later on in the process, yeah, you may have a decent argument. And you can show that, you know what, you're a high enrolling physician site, you this is a patient you really care about, and you think that based on your experience the patient can benefit from it. It looks good for the pharmaceutical company because they get to do PR from it, and it looks good for the site because they're helping the patients, and that's what they're there for. Again, in those situations you need to be careful. You need to be careful specifically, is this a patient or is this a subject? There may be potential Stark Law issues associated with that as well. Do you know what the Stark Law is, Dan?
I've heard of it, but can you just refresh my mind?
Sure. Stark Law is the law against self-referral. So several decades ago, what used to happen was physicians used to own lab practices and own office sites.
Yes.
So what you'd have is this, and everyone thought physicians were pure, and they are for the most part. They do their best to be, as you put it, pure. But what they noticed was this unusual thing where physicians who own two practices would do a lot of self referrals. So there'd be a lot of labs that would be done by physicians who own lab practices. So what they said was, we're going to create the Stark Law. The Stark Law is going to say that you can't refer unless there's a good justification for it. But that referral concept applies across the board. It's not just lab practices. What happens if you're a physician who owns your actual doctor site and you own a clinical trial site? Are you doing a referral? Especially if your site is doing a study that bills Medicare and Medicaid.
Well, yes, and I can tell you that a lot of the sponsors from the site level, because that's my experience pretty much, is sponsors are now specifically recruiting sites that have a private practice on site. So, like, if your PI, he does studies on site, but he also sees patients for his private practice. And they do that because there's been a huge issue in clinical trials with professional patients and patients just doing studies for money, and so they jump from one site to another doing the same study, and the sponsors are getting the same data and wasting money. So they want the research naive patients, that's what they call it, research naive. And the only way to really assure that, or the best way, is to have them come directly from your private practice, because that means they're not going anywhere else. And even under those situations, they still might, but the chances are greatly reduced because you're supposed to know where they're going.
Absolutely. And but again, when you do that, just make sure you have appropriate protections in place to separate out your physician site, your clinic, if you will, from your clinical trial site. And you make sure that appropriate referrals are made, and if there's any kind of money being transferred, how is that money being transferred, and to what extent and why. Make sure you have the appropriate contracts in place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That's very good for the research clinics out there who are listening right now to pay attention. That's very good advice.
Thank you. The other thing to think about is you still have a lot of physicians, I've seen them, own their own lab practices as well. They aren't aware of this Stark Law issue. So what they do in those situations is they sometimes negotiate it so that they become either, instead of a site, they become CROs, or instead of, they become SMOs, and they then make their own lab practice the centralized lab, and they get money that way. Again, just be careful when you do that type of work.
So self-referrals, there's a lot of issues around that.
Exactly.
All right, any other circumstances where investigational product might be used and physicians may have problems?
I think of. If they have something more specific, I'm sure we'll have a follow-up conversation about it.
Yes, I will send the viewer, who shall remain anonymous, because I keep you anonymous on this show. Don't be afraid to ask your questions, Dan at theclinicaltrialsguru.com. I keep you anonymous by default, so don't be afraid, all right? I obviously, I'll see your name, but I will not mention it unless you specifically ask me to. Otherwise, I will not. Just like this person. So thank you very much. Ask your follow-up question. We'll do follow-up videos. And Darshan, what is your website?
You can find me at www.conformlaw.com. That's www.conformlaw.com. Or you can find me on Twitter at fdalawyers.com. Or you can just Google my name and it comes up. It's Darshan Kulkarni. That's Kulkarni. I look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, hit up Darshan, and I want to give my Clinical Trial Guru producers a shout-out. Sarah Elizabeth Siegler, Resolve Research Solutions, Accurate Clinical Trials, Erdhart Clinical Trials, PTNR, Patrick Stone, Mr. Darshan Kulkarni, Biopharm Systems, Zymewire, Mozio, South Coast Clinical Trials, Breakthrough Clinical Trials, St. Paul Medical Research Center in Miami, Florida, and there's 3 other clinics that just signed up, so I will get you next time. Thank you very much, Dan from theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Take care.